It doesn't take a declaration to know the world is shifting. Sometimes you only need to see who's standing together. In recent months, Vladimir Putin walked beneath red banners in Beijing to grip Xi Jinping's hand as cameras rolled. Not long after, Kim Jong-un paced beside Russian generals while long-range missiles rumbled through Pyongyang. In the same waters, Iranian drones, Chinese radars, and Russian warships have drilled side by side. None of this is coincidence. It's the outline of a new order, drawn not through treaties, but through intent. A quiet alignment taking shape beneath the surface, bound by a single idea: end Western dominance. If it ever hardens into a formal pact, the balance of the world we know could collapse overnight. Because what's forming isn't just a military bloc, it's the beginning of an anti-NATO world, and in many ways, it's already here. For 2 years, global tensions stopped being a mosaic of isolated crises and became something deeper: a structural shift in power. The world once held together by Western leadership is starting to split along new seams. NATO, for decades the symbol of collective security, stands as the last pillar of an old architecture. Beneath it, a rival axis is assembling itself around sovereignty, control, and resistance to Western leverage. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. 4 capitals, different ambitions, one converging thesis. The West no longer gets to define stability. Every alliance begins long before it has a name. First comes a pattern, a convergence of interests, a quiet synchronization of purpose. That is what we're seeing now. The crises that began in Ukraine, the Middle East, and the Pacific have fused into a shared perception that the Western order has lost legitimacy, balance, and any pretense of treating Moscow as an equal. For Beijing, the resentment was layered through years of export controls, tech restrictions, and strategic competition. For Tehran, it calcified across decades of sanctions that turned self-sufficiency into ideology. For Pyongyang, survival has always been the point: stay visible, stay feared, stay relevant.
They don't trust each other. History proves that. They have spied, clashed, and undercut each other for decades. But in today's fractured system, trust isn't the currency of power. Leverage is. What unites them isn't friendship or shared values. It's the calculation that together they can dilute American influence without meeting it head-on. Through weapons transfers, energy swaps, cyber coordination, and synchronized narratives, they're building a web, not a pact. A pressure system designed to flex wherever the West is thinnest. You can see the web if you know where to look. Moscow's battlefield drones started as Shaheeds shipped from Iran. Now Russia manufactures adapted models and components at home, squeezing more effect out of cheaper airframes while straining Ukraine's air defenses, a partnership that moved from purchase orders to joint production in less than 2 years. In parallel, freight and finance lanes between Russia and China have thickened. Oil barrels and discounted products slide east, and more trade clears outside of dollars through state banks and bespoke channels. In the Gulf of Oman, a pinch point for global energy, Russian, Chinese, and Iranian navies have rehearsed together year after year, normalizing operations that would have been headline-shocking a decade ago. North Korea, once a peripheral wildcard, transformed into a direct supplier of ammunition, rockets, and even ballistic missiles to Russia's war. Shipments documented by Western governments and UN monitors, highlighting just how fluid sanctions enforcement has become. That flow was reportedly met with fuel, air defense assistance, and other barter that keeps Pyongyang's programs alive. A sanctions evasion loop that moves the region closer to a permanent standoff. This is why formality doesn't matter. When one member is sanctioned, the others adjust. When one is accused, the rest harmonize the script. The alliance doesn't need a flag or headquarters when it already functions in practice. Its strength is ambiguity. Each capital claims independence while acting as part of a larger design. By the time the West feels comfortable calling it what it is, it could be too late, because an alliance that doesn't officially exist can't be officially contained. Cooperation becomes architecture, one repetition at a time. A drone batch here, a radar shipment there. Engines from one country, chips from another, guidance tweaks from a third. Different industries feeding the same battlefield until logistics replace loyalty. Then energy flows are rewired. Russian crude redirected east, Iranian gas hedged through Chinese financial channels, North Korean coal and minerals moving under fresh labels. As supply chains learn to live without Western gatekeepers, the habit of dependence breaks, and habits are the hardest things to restore. Even in Ukraine, debris from downed drones and missiles keeps revealing just how international the component supply has stayed, despite sanctions and export controls. The most powerful link, though, isn't steel or fuel. It's the reflex. The press statement that echoes, the UN vote that aligns, the televised speech that repeats the same phrases in different languages. As these rhythms converge, trade, weapons, diplomacy, tech, the need for a treaty evaporates. Function replaces form. Once that function is mature, Washington stops being referee and becomes one player among many. Every sanction, every patrol, every diplomatic warning is answered by a coordinated wall of resistance. The United States has long relied on an equation: act against one, and the rest hesitate. That equation breaks when action against one awakens all. Deterrence itself begins to mutate. During the Cold War, two superpowers shared one brutal rule: mutual survival. In this proto-system, the math isn't destruction, it's distraction. Russia pulls Europe off balance. China stretches the Pacific. Iran ties down the Middle East. Each crisis feeds the others, stretching Western bandwidth until control turns into reaction. Power stops being about striking first or holding ground. It becomes about forcing your opponent to defend everywhere at once. That is the American nightmare: logistics and psychology. The Pentagon owns hardware for 3 theaters. It does not own infinite attention, bipartisan focus, or public patience. The anti-NATO axis doesn't have to win. It only has to exhaust, make democracy look inefficient, diplomacy irrelevant, leadership fragmented.
For NATO allies, the balance frays further. Europe is tied to U.S. defense and to Asian demand. A South China Sea crisis can idle German assembly lines. An oil shock linked to an Iranian escalation can choke Eastern Europe. Collective defense risks morphing into collective vulnerability. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ledger, BRICS expanded to include Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the UAE in 2024. A signal, more symbolic than structural, that non-Western forums are widening, even as Saudi Arabia kept its seat undecided. From there, the map tilts. A rival center of gravity doesn't split the world overnight, it leans it. Every region, market, and alliance starts to feel the pull. Europe becomes a hinge, dependent on American security, reliant on Eastern inputs. Geography turns from advantage to exposure. Every gas shipment, every undersea cable, every UN vote carries the weight of divided loyalty. The Middle East stops being a chessboard and becomes a player. Tehran's survival is no longer about evading sanctions. It's about belonging to a bloc that converts isolation into leverage. Riyadh reads the room, still bound to the dollar, yet confronted by markets and forums that promise autonomy from Washington's preferences. The region's future stops depending on who pumps oil and starts depending on who prices it, and in which currency. Asia stretches in 2 directions at once. Japan and South Korea remain anchored to Washington's security guarantees. China knits a web through ports, pipelines, and digital infrastructure. Southeast Asia becomes the prize not for its armies, but for its algorithms. Whoever builds its data routes and cloud backbones will own the information arteries of the next century. And then there's Africa, the quiet tiebreaker.
While Western capitals debate principles, Beijing and Moscow keep laying roads, rails, satellite links, and security deals, often imperfect, often transactional, but present. In the new calculus, presence beats promise. The continent isn't developing. It's decisive, the source of rare minerals, new naval access, and a demographic engine that will shape demand and politics for generations. In this world, no flashpoint is local. Taiwan, Syria, the Red Sea, Ukraine, each functions like a fault line. A drone strike in the Gulf moves fuel prices in New York. A cyber attack in Asia darkens screens in Europe. The border between regional and global collapses, replaced by a single crowded chessboard with too many players convinced they're winning.
For the United States, the impact isn't just geopolitical, it's existential. U.S. leadership after 1945 wasn't a slogan, it was identity. If an anti-NATO world takes shape, Washington remains powerful, but no longer central. That sounds semantic. It isn't. A superpower without the world's default attention is just another nation with interests to defend. Politically, the change ends the moral monopoly. The American habit of defining democracy, deciding which wars are just, or who deserves sanctions, meets a mirror. A rival system with its own legitimacy script. Every U.S. statement draws a counterstatement. Every alliance offer meets a counteroffer. Authority slips from dominance into negotiation. Economically, the consequences cut deeper. The dollar doesn't crash, it erodes. The bloodstream of global trade faces new payment systems, energy deals that bypass New York, and settlement in yuan, rubles, or regional mechanisms. The danger isn't a single event, it's replacement by routine. When nations no longer need dollars to trade, they need less American permission to act. Strategically, the question becomes endurance. American basing and blue water reach are unmatched, but sustaining them against a coordinated rival network grows costlier. Multiple fronts, fewer surprises, thinner psychological edge. Every deployment feels heavier, every intervention riskier. The question shifts from can the U.S. act to can it afford to act everywhere at once? The deepest shock is psychological. For generations, Americans lived with a quiet assumption their country kept chaos over there. If an alternative system rises, that distance collapses. The free world stops being a fact and becomes a belief, one not everyone shares. When belief cracks, the security built on it fractures too. The shift won't look like invasion, it will feel like noise. New currencies, pricier energy, supply chain whiplash, rolling cyber outages. Underneath, the real transformation is internal. The realization that America no longer sets the rhythm by default. When power stops being invisible, people feel its absence. When dominance becomes participation, the myth of control fades, and what replaces it is something the country hasn't felt in decades: uncertainty.
As America's certainty fades, the rest of the world doesn't freeze, it recalculates. An anti-NATO axis would force every nation, willing or not, to choose where to belong. The question won't be democracy versus authoritarianism. It will be stability versus dependence. In a fractured order, neutrality stops being virtue and becomes risk. Middle powers, India, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, get pulled from both sides. Their economies lean west, their geography and resources pull east. In a polarized market, balancing quickly turns into exposure. Try to play both fields and you become the field. Trade routes realign first. The open oceans become corridors of control. The South China Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Arctic, each transforms into a gated strait where access depends on allegiance. Technology follows the split. Satellites,
Cloud platforms, app stores, everything built to connect starts to divide. The world's internet stops being one network and becomes two ecosystems. One Western, argued over by regulators and publics, one statist, optimized for control and surveillance. Every country must choose which web to plug into, and that choice will shape its politics more than any election. Energy completes the split. Pipelines, nuclear partnerships, rare earth supply, they stop being neutral trades and become instruments of loyalty. Nations that once sold to everyone are asked to prioritize. A power outage, a drought, a fuel shock, no longer local problems, but signals of alignment or punishment. Unlike the Cold War, this won't arrive with walls and declarations. It will unfold inside markets, code, and supply chains. Two worlds on the same planet, one fluent in freedom and the friction it brings, one fluent in control and the efficiencies it buys. The fault line won't show up on a map. It will run through every port, every company, every switch you flip in the name of survival. In such a system, even standing still becomes political. For many capitals, the choice won't be which side to join, but which side they can afford to anger. The next world map won't be drawn by borders, but by dependencies. Here's the truth that matters. This anti-NATO world isn't a vague idea. It's a path. And paths turn dangerous when they start to feel inevitable. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Two blocks, two visions, one prize, the power to write the rules. The real question isn't whether the alliance will be born, it's whether anyone can interrupt the convergence before it hardens into structure. The first casualty of a world split in two isn't territory, it's options. The second is time. Polarized systems accelerate decisions, multiply misreads, and push leaders to respond to pressure instead of purpose. Wars rarely start with missiles. They start with schedules, sanctions, and narratives that leave no exits. The only antidote is clarity. Channels that stay open when everything else closes. Guardrails paid for in advance. A willingness to absorb costs today to prevent drift from becoming fate tomorrow. For citizens, that means lucidity, not panic. For leaders, restraint that doesn't look like weakness. For alliances, flexibility without fear. Because when the world divides, strength belongs to those who keep thinking while the machinery tries to think for them. In the end, the next era won't be decided by the largest arsenal, but by the side that refuses to lose its cool head. If you want to understand the world not through headlines, but through logic, before the noise turns into panic, subscribe to the Survival Brief. We don't chase fear, we break it down. The more you understand, the less you're controlled.